have you ever felt that pressure of like who should be the more masculine one or who should be the more like feminine one in the relationship?
Yeah.
A lot to unpack here.
Right, for sure. Do you want to go first?
Hi everyone, welcome back to the Gray Area Podcast. As you all know, this is the podcast at Student Health where we talk about the messy, sometimes confusing, sort of ambiguous parts of relationships, especially in the sort of college era and college age. I'm Jenny. I'm one of the Wellbeing and Health Outreach Ambassadors here at USC Student Health, and I'm joined here today by two amazing guests, Sam and KG, which I'll have them introduce themselves. Sam, do you want to go first?
Yeah, my name is Sam, and I'm a sophomore psychology student at USC, and I am here as part of the Queer to Peer organization, which is kind of run under CARE SC. And our goal is to kind of like advocate for queer rights, and we do little educational like kind of demonstrations and kind of lectures and things like that to just expand people's knowledge about just kind of like queer relationships and things like that.
Hey y'all, my name is KG. I use they, them pronouns. I've been working in student health since July 2021 and excited to be on with Jenny and Sam today to have a thoughtful conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited about the topic of today's episode, which is we're going to be kind of talking about and unpacking sort of heteronormativity and how it shows up in queer relationships and just relationships in general. I think there's a lot that we can talk about here, so I am excited to get into it.
Yeah.
But I guess first we can talk a little bit about gender roles and like the most common ones that we see show up in relationships. Most recently, like I was in a heterosexual relationship, and things like who like pays for like the first date, or like who pays for dinners, who pays for meals, like those are things that come up very naturally, and if you're not really taking a second to step back and like think about those things, like it just seems as like kind of like a given sometimes. But it's those kinds of gender roles aren't only like seen in heterosexual relationships, which is super interesting. But I was wondering if let's talk a little bit about like that pressure to maybe conform to these like traditionally masculine or feminine roles in relationships. In like queer relationships, LGBTQ plus relationships. Like, have you ever felt that pressure of like who should be the more masculine one or who should be the more like feminine one in the relationship?
Yeah.
A lot to unpack here.
Right, for sure. Do you want to go first?
Man, you was reading that question. I was like, yes,
Right.
all of that and then some, right? I think it's really challenging when we live in society that kind of creates these norms, right? And we base it off of, heterosexuality. So we kind of follow that blueprint because anything outside of that is deemed wrong, right? So we naturally kind of fall into kind of these patterns. So definitely have felt that pressure, especially early in my dating. Like, oh, well, I dress more masculine, so do I supposed to pick up the check? But I'm broke. I ain't got no money, right? But I felt that pressure that I had to do that. And I think, it took some understanding of that, some unlearning of it to be able to communicate that in my relationships. Like, what makes sense? Who actually asked me, okay, you have more money this week, so you're going to treat us, right? Versus me feeling like I have to take on all of that pressure. I'll pause for a little bit. I'll let you jump in.
I actually I'm curious about if you think being, I guess, as an adult now, have people kind of move past that very strict sense of heteronormativity, or is it still very prevalent, would you say?
I think it depends on who I'm talking to, right? Yeah. In my relationship, it's a very kind of egalitarian type thing. Like I said, whoever got it this way, okay, you got it, babe, cool. We'll do that, right? Yeah. But I think there are some spaces where there is pressure to, feel like you have to take on the masculine or be the man or whatever type of position in the relationship because in a lot of ways, I think it legitimizes the relationship because you're modeling after, what society tells you is right. Which is unfortunate, but it's the reality that we live in,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think even just in a kind of different sense, and in dating apps, it's always this expectation of the person who I guess appears more masculine on their app, or just kind of curates themselves to appear more masculine, is the one that needs to always be the one to reach out, or so that's not even in a relationship necessarily, but just in a dating app setting. But definitely in my own relationships, I've felt like, I've experienced multiple queer relationships with guys, and there's always been that pressure, like, like I'm always the one who's driving just because I have a car, which is like, fine. But like, I think a big thing is like, oh, who's planning the dates and things like that. And I found myself sometimes in a situation where I'm more often like the one, I guess, taking initiative to plan the date or being like, oh, let's go do this. And it's like, I don't even know like if I'd categorize myself as more masculine. Like I don't know if I would say that, but like it's all relative, right, in the relationship, I feel like. So yeah, like a lot of planning dates is a big one. Like a lot of times it's like the masculine person is always the one coming up with ideas, and like, let's go do this. Like, and I feel like I was just talking to like a female friend, and she was like, I really like don't get that. Like she was like, I want to be the one, like if anything, I want to be planning most of the dates, you know what I mean? So it just kind of like people have very different perspectives on that.
Absolutely. I felt I resonated with what you said, and I remember just kind of early on feeling that pressure of like, okay, I gotta plan the day, I gotta pay for the day. And I think as I have gotten older, it's been a thing of like even rotating who plans the date, or like, okay, this is your month to think of a date, this is your month to think of the date. And it takes a lot of pressure off, and it also brings an intentionality into the relationship where we're both like invested, or all invested. I don't want to limit it to only two partners being in a relationship because they look different, right? But yeah, it shows up, I think, the gender roles in terms of like how you sound, right? I dress more masculine, but you hear my voice. Like I don't have a deep voice, right? But I think early on, like you feel like, okay, I have to match whatever this kind of expectation is for me to kind of show up in relationships, for sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you might sort of approach these hard or even like uncomfortable conversations, either in those like early stages of dating or when you're in a more like serious long-term relationship, especially when you're both young, maybe you're both in college. But like, how do you approach those conversations, like addressing it either directly or indirectly like, with your partner?
Yeah. I think just kind of maybe even sitting down with students, one of the things that I would invite people to think about is just kind of, where did you learn this script from, and is this a script that is still working for you, right? Because I always say, if something is working for you, I'm not going to touch it, right? But if you notice that there's this pressure, like, oh, I'm always having to do this or take on this role, then maybe we need to re-examine that, right? So after we build this awareness and we decide whether or not we want to continue or discontinue, then being able to create those new scripts, right? So giving language of, okay, well, how do you want your relationship to look, right? Do you want it to have more harmony of whoever has it will take on the slack, or, whatever you define that as? So like being able to name like, hey, I understand that we may be falling into this trap of heteronormativity, but I want our relationship to be fresh. I want it to be unique to us, right? And having them have conversation with their different partners to kind of co-create what that relationship could look like. So I think just starting there from this awareness piece, this separation from these narratives that no longer serve them, and then them being able to co-create what they want their relationships to look like will be where I would, start or support a student with.
For sure. And
yeah.
In terms of like being able to unpack that, like those internalized gender roles, these things that we're taught from like since they were born, just like that internalized like heteronormativity, like how do you suggest, like are there any like methods you suggest of like how to identify those like assumptions we may already have, those internalized assumptions, and like how we can begin to like sort of like deconstruct them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think just that awareness and self-monitoring is really good. And even thinking about the way that we speak about things, I often pause people like, hold on, where did you get that from? How did you learn that? Right? And I think once we are aware of something, then we have the ability to change it, right? So I think that awareness is very like baseline, first level, and then once you make that decision that you want to take action, that can support them of like, okay, so what is the current narrative that we're looking at? Are there any components that you want to keep? Any components that's working for you right now? Right? Because I like to talk about kind of like all or nothing thinking. I don't know if you're familiar with that, or black and white thinking of like, rarely does life exist in the extremes, right? I don't think that a lot of things are all good or all bad. There are components that have worked for you, otherwise you wouldn't engage in the behavior, right? So let's hold on to that. What are the parts that no longer serve you, all right? And then we can start to replace that.
When you're like in partnership with another person too, like it's not only this like individual journey of like being able to unpack those assumptions, but also like being able to talk through it with like your partner or this other person. Like, I don't know, have you had any experiences where the other person, like your partner, is like less receptive to like deconstructing like those gender roles? Or I don't know, like have you had any of those experiences?
I think actually I can learn a lot from KG here, because I feel like even in any of my relationships, which I think each one has definitely been like a step, like kind of an improvement towards like something that works for me. But I think in all of them, I don't remember having, at least not frequently, like sit down conversations where actually being like, okay, like let's talk about this and the way we're doing this. And like, for example, like sometimes I feel like I'm the one initiating like PDA, like nothing crazy, but like even just holding hands, right? And like I'm always the one like, I'll grab your hand and like initiate that. And it's like, that's something that would, like, I feel like that is part of the heteronormative thing of like, oh, you know, like the more masculine guy will do this first. And so I definitely felt like that was something that I might want to address, but I just like never just initiated it, or like I didn't want to be the one to initiate it. And so I never really had this conversation, so I feel like I can learn a lot here from this. But what was I going to say as well? And like I feel like there were times when, in terms of receptiveness, in my like most previous relationship, I feel like my partner would like, we didn't discuss, this conversation wasn't about gender roles specifically, but it was about communication. Like, oh, like I was telling him, I would love if you did certain things, like just like kind of opened up the conversation more and asked me more about myself. And he seemed he was kind of listening and like nodding and stuff, but I feel like he didn't really make the changes. So like sometimes like his receptiveness is just like, you can still be listening, but it's like, how receptive are you actually changing your like behaviors, you know?
Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah, that definitely can be tough, because like there's this fine line with that of like, do they know how to change those behaviors, or are they unwilling to do that? And those are different fields, like for me, right? So if somebody doesn't know how, they can be taught, right? And I think a lot of times we feel like shy or hesitant to teach our partners or in relationships or communicate our needs, like in relationships, because we have this assumption that they should know. Right, like if you love me, you care about me, I shouldn't have to say this, right? And that's a misconception. I have conversations with people all the time of like, I wish that people could read my mind, right? And I don't have to do this extra labor of communicating the needs, but they don't know. And we have to give them the tools so that they can be successful. Now if they have the tools and they choose not to use it, now that's a different conversation. Right, so I just wanted to highlight that piece too.
I've gone through that, hoping / expecting that the other person could read my mind, when that's just not possible. But I mean, I thought it was interesting the point you brought up about like initiating PDA in public. That also, I think, brings in this aspect of having a relationship in like a more, I guess, like public sense, or like within like a broader like societal context. I'm curious, like not just having these conversations like with your partner, but also like having conversations about like your relationship with like maybe your loved ones, like your family members, or like your friends who are like outside of the relationship. Like, do you experience like other like external people making like assumptions about your relationship, like people who like either like people close to your life, or even like, I don't know, like a waiter, assuming that like this person like or you is going to be like setting the bill in front of them, or like just those like external assumptions?
Yeah.
Oh, that was a lot. I'm gonna sit on that.
Yeah, for sure. I do think like I think a lot of my friends are more like I guess open-minded, so they wouldn't be like verbally saying things out loud, that even if they are assuming it. I'm sure a lot of people have like assumptions that they just don't say out loud, which I respect. But I think like sometimes there's definitely this thing of like my most recent partner was like a lot taller, and like he did dress a lot more in a more masculine sense than I did. Even though like that, it wasn't that like cut and dry, it wasn't that simple black and white, right? Like you can present yourself some ways in more masculine, and other ways not as much. And I do think like people would like definitely assume things, and like sometimes it would come out and just like the assumptions they would make about like, there's also a lot of people who are like assuming you're you're like, I don't know how to say it in a less like explicit sense, but like top or bottom, or like, or I guess like more dominant, or like the more like submissive person in the relationship, even just not in a like sexual sense, but just like relationally. And I think a lot of people would assume like my position in the relationship, and I mean it doesn't even have to be like super explicit. It's just like the way people perceive you, I guess, and like something you're constantly aware of. I guess just generally we would be a lot more, in all of my relationships we've been a lot more reserved. Like my partner wasn't very like excited to like do any like kind of hand holding or anything, so we would always just kind of like, I feel like, more portray ourselves as just friends in public, out of fear of like being judged or
yeah. And in terms of like your friends maybe directly or indirectly making like those assumptions about like your relationship dynamics, I feel like that can definitely be like uncomfortable, especially if you do want to like be more private about like the intimate details of your relationship. Do you have like any suggestions for like any tools or like ways you can maybe like draw those boundaries where it's like, I don't really feel comfortable like sharing that kind of information with you, because at the end of the day it's like just our business, like it's my business, or things like that, like those kinds of conversations, because especially if it is like a loved one, like a family member, like a friend, I feel like it can be hard to like have those boundary drawing conversations.
Most definitely. I think you did a beautiful job just then of like demonstrating an example of that, like, hey, I don't feel comfortable like discussing this with you. And I think boundary setting can be a very like uncomfortable like conversation. Like you feel like you're doing something wrong or you're being mean, and boundaries are very natural. Like this door right here is a boundary, right, that we have, and it exists all around us. And being able to set these standards or limitations for yourself, or what you will and will not tolerate, is going to be important for you to be able to exist authentically, in your relationship. So I think being able to set those boundaries, being able to communicate like assertively, what you need. And what I mean by that is like speaking from your personal, like I feel this, your own experience, right? And centering both the respect for yourself by being able to communicate honestly, and then the respect for the other people that's on the receiving end, right? Because I think sometimes we, maybe grin and bear it, and we may engage in maybe passive or passive aggressive or even aggressive communication styles, and they're really ineffective. Right, so being able to be clear and assertive in our communication and setting those boundaries to protect our peace is essential.
And I just want to like kind of go off, like continue with the idea of like, there's a lot of different ways of setting boundaries, and sometimes if you aren't able to do it in like a very like just like a formal, more open setting, we can just like sit down and say like, this is how I feel. Sometimes if people are afraid to do that, then it comes out in very like negative ways, where it's like, for example, like from a lot of my partners, it's come out in kind of like sarcasm or like kind of statements that are a little bit more passive aggressive, because they're afraid to just say like, honestly, this is how I feel. And so at like times when it really irritates them, then it like comes out. Yeah. And so like, and this is a kind of an example of that. It's like my recent partner would just sometimes make little comments about like the way like my voice sounds or like the way I walk. And obviously he should, like either way, even if he sat down and told me like, hey, I don't like the way you like, or your voice is kind of high pitched, that's obviously just the way I express myself. That's not his thing to change, but at least we could have had a conversation where he expressed I might have some certain aspects of like heteronormativity or internalized homophobia, and like at least if he opened that box up, then it wouldn't have hurt me as much when he made these comments about like like little jokes about how I walk or things like that. So I think just like communicating openly rather than like doing it sooner, instead of like letting it kind of like bottle up, and then a lot of times it comes out in like not great ways.
And I want to build off of that too, because when you said like the verbal may not always be comfortable, you can do nonverbal boundaries too. Like it could be limited access to your social media story, right? Okay, only my close friends, people that celebrate me, can see this, right? Oh, this family member over here or this friend, they always have something slick to say. I'm not gonna let them have access to intimate details of my life, right? So I kind of like explain boundaries to like students that I work with. It's like kind of like your house, like the metaphorical house, right? Everybody didn't get the address to your house. And even when they get the address, that don't mean they can freely roam around your house, right? There may be some people where you just talk to them on the outside of your porch or front yard or whatever the case may be. There may be people that can go to the kitchen and bathroom and all that, right? But you get to decide those limits and parameters that people have access to you.
For sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm also glad that earlier you brought up this point of like internalized homophobia, because I think internalized homophobia and heteronormativity are definitely like hand in hand, I think. Like, I don't know if you've ever felt or like witnessed or experienced like maybe having these heteronormative norms like still in your mind because like maybe there's this internalized assumption that like, oh, like is my relationship like less like, valid? Like having those like, yeah, I don't know. I don't really know what like my question is here though. But...
No, I think I like understand. Yeah. Yeah, I think I definitely like it's kind of like a all-consuming. Or like it affects everyone universally. I think to differing extents, and I think like mine like has come from different sources. But in middle school, like a lot of people would make more like lighthearted jokes about like because I'm a figure skater, and obviously that's something that's very associated with like femininity, and so like I would get a lot of jokes of like the gay skater boy and things like that. That like I've obviously come to like like I'm very proud of that now. Like that's like I've embraced that, but like back then it would like I would see it as a bad thing, so I'd like shrug it off or like joke like, oh yeah, like totally yeah, haha. But yeah, I feel like in all my relationships, unfortunately, like I've noticed like with my partner, even in myself, like ways that it manifests, and a lot of it's just like I said, things with like how comfortable they are, and I understand people have their own like boundaries of how they want to be perceived in public, but I think a lot of that also has to do with internalized homophobia. Like I'm afraid to even just hold your hand because it's like just being perceived by other people. And yeah, I think it's kind of like there's just little ways that you'll see it, and like especially in public is where it's really like I feel like I always felt like my public life and my private life was very different, and I think some of that was amplified by the fact that it's like a queer relationship. Yeah.
And you make me think too, like not even the perceptions piece, but is it like physically, emotionally safe for me to like, show any form of like PDA? But I want to come back to your, question about this internalized like, homonegativity and all of this. I think that we would be remiss if we didn't talk about like intersectionality and culture and how that influences these experiences, right? I know just personally growing up in a religious background, that influenced a lot of kind of this internalized, heteronormativity, and I think that, from a cultural component, ethnicity-wise or religion, spirituality, those components matter, right? And being able to kind of tease apart, like at least like in conversations that I have with people, okay, like what messaging have you heard? Like, what does it mean to be queer, to be religious, to be, black, or what? I'm just using those as an example, but what does that mean for you, right? And being able to have those conversations is important.
I'm really glad you brought that up, and I think like this is also so tied to maybe like your relationship with like your family, like your parents. If either like you're out to them or you're not out to them, or when you're maybe like introducing your relationship to your parents, I feel like that's such a complex thing to work through. But for example, like depending on your background, maybe your parents are less like educated, they're less aware of like queer relationships, like what they are, or even just like these dynamics. But I remember once having a conversation with my mother when I was younger, and she maybe like on the internet or something like had heard of bisexuality for the first time, and she just like asked me like out of curiosity, like she was like, does that mean like you're dating both men and women at the same time? And I was like, not necessarily. That doesn't necessarily mean that's not what it necessarily means. But I remember like just being very struck by that conversation, that like I don't know, like having this feeling of like having to meet your parents like where they're at. And like sometimes it might feel easier to kind of explain your identity or like your relationship in like their terms, like so that they understand it the best, but also like having to deal with like, oh, like why do I have to like maybe explain this in like heteronormative terms or things like that. Like I feel like that's something very like complex and like the family dynamics.
Yeah.
There's a lot there.
That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
No, I mean, like, that can be, like, a very exhausting thing, and I think that goes back to our conversation around boundaries, right? Like, do I want to take on the educator role right now and get into all the dynamics of what it means to be queer, bisexual, or all these things, right? Or am I going to be like, hey, you know, Google is free. Hey, check out this website or this book or whatever the case may be, right? But you have to be the manager of like your energy and your peace, and you determine that, like, do I have the capacity to engage in this right now? If yes, go ahead, do your thing, right? It works for you. But if not, then okay, how may I pivot in managing this?
Yeah.
For sure.
I definitely imagine like it would be even harder when it's like someone like if it's like a really close to your mom or like your dad, it's like telling them to just like look it up. It's like it can be scary, or to like use other sources, because sometimes you're like, I don't know where that's coming from, or like where they're getting their information. But yeah, I think you can't just like expect yourself to. It's a lot of pressure to like have to educate, especially if there's like a lot of people in your family that might not get it. It's like you don't have to keep having the conversation. Yeah.
You bring up a good point. This is me in my 30-year-old brain saying this. Let me come back. Okay. So with that can be very, you know, intimidating to be like, oh, you know, you should check this out. And obviously the way that you present that is going to be important, where you're not like, oh, go Google this, mom, or whatever, right? But like, you know, it could be a thing of like, you know, hey, you know, today isn't a good time to talk about this, but maybe we can revisit this, you know, later. Or if you know of good resources that you have read or seen, like, hey, I saw this video, I think it'd be cool for you to check out. After you watch it, let's talk about it a little bit more. And then maybe we can, you know, have a little bit more shared understanding about my experiences, right? So that may be a more gentler way to maybe go about that path. So I appreciate you for bringing that to my attention to come back to my 20-year-old version. So
Yes, yeah.
I think I do want to move to some of the student submitted questions we had, or less so questions, but things that students submitted that they say like are on their mind right now related to this topic. We asked students via our Instagram at Trojan Health Hub on the Instagram story about any like things that have showed up in like their like personal experiences as well. So I'd like to get into that. I think like the two like student submitted questions I did want to talk about are actually kind of like I think kind of hand in hand. So one person said they experienced like masculine/feminine roles despite it being like a same-sex relationship, and then someone else said, just pointing out like paying for the date, eyes emoji. But I think those are kind of two sides of the same coin. But I know we like did like talk about this more in depth earlier, but things like these norms like paying for the date, again, we talked about that earlier, but I guess like what's like your kind of simplified or like your main advice for someone who does like experience that sort of like assumption, like maybe like a little side eye of like expecting like I'm the one that's gonna be paying, like again, if you get uncomfortable, especially if it's like maybe like a first date, maybe like it's a first impression, and like you do want to seem like you are like, you know, like you're a good partner, but like maybe you financially like don't want to, and you'd rather split the bill. Like how do you have those conversations without? I don't know. Dating is hard. Dating is hard.
It is. I would say, I guess like sometimes I would just like, if I felt like I was the one contributing more financially, or just like, you know, like planning the dates more, I would just be like, hey, like, do you want to, like, I'd be very like, just like, you know, how do you feel about like wanting to like plan a date or something? Like, what do you feel like doing? And like, usually if someone's kind of like planning the date or like being more proactive in a relationship, they're more also willing to like, you know, contribute, like, I don't put money into it, or like, you know, not that money is like the driving factor, but like that's a good way to just like nudge them, I guess, to, you know, I guess to experiment more, like to try more, like, and not that it should be masculine, but like a more, I guess, traditionally masculine thing, or just like planning the date, or like, you know, I think, just like gentle nudges and encouragement. And I think like, based on what you said also, I'm guessing it's a really good way to just say like, do you actually like really care about like wanting to be the one that like gets all your stuff covered by the other person and is more like in a more feminine like role, or is that just something that you've only done, like that's all you've ever done and you've just never like experimented or tried something else? You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Okay, so simplified version, I think when we assume that's because we haven't communicated, I think communicating beforehand, because you don't want that awkward moment when the bill come out. I give it to, and then the eyes, right? So like when y'all are setting up the date, like what are the expectations for paying for the date? Like are we splitting this? Like are you expecting me to pay? Are you like we can talk about that. Are we doing a rotating thing, right? So having conversations about, how you want to approach it before you get into those situations can be helpful. But even if you do find yourself in that situation because y'all didn't cover it, you can just say, so how you want to do this, right? I still find myself doing that today. Like, how are we doing this? Are we splitting? We pulling from something else? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
As we kind of wrap up this amazing conversation, I do want to kind of go back to some of those points we were talking about earlier about what kind of work we can do to like unpack these internalized assumptions. And I guess if you have like any parting words for our students who are kind of working, and I know that this is like a constant process too, like you're always going to be like reflecting on like what kind of internalized assumptions you have and like working through them. Like it's a constant process, but I don't know, any like parting words you have about what we can like do like starting like now or starting like tomorrow to like make those reflections and like move forward.
So this is gonna be kind of like a dead horse for me, but I think the first is awareness, the self-reflection, and really having a community around you that you can kind of hold you accountable to when they notice that you may be engaging in practices that don't fit you and how you want to exist in your relationships. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I emphasize that. Like I mentioned just like having sometimes with one of my partners like say negative comments to me, and like I've had times where my friends were like literally with us and they were like, yeah, like I noticed that, and I know that's not what you would have appreciated at the time, and they like kind of had a conversation with me after that led me to like also like realize more things about myself and like my boundaries. And I think having a really good support group is super important, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Finding that support system, either like through like your loved ones and also like through external resources too, like at Student Health. At least like on campus there are so many like resources that students can take advantage of to like have these conversations, keep having these conversations with like a trusted person, with an expert. But like, are there any like resources you recommend through the USC Student Health?
Yeah. Definitely, if you want to, do this work individually, go on my SHR, book you an appointment. There are different groups that you can join, and I love groups because I think, yes, you can have some really in-depth work when you do the one-on-one kind of work, but when you're in community with people, you realize that there's a shared experience and you can learn so much in those spaces. So those groups will also be online as well, and then we have embedded therapists. So go to the LGBTQ Center. They have a lot of different programming, so being in community is always a healing thing for us, and we learn, we grow, and we heal in community. So that's where I'll start.
Yeah.
And Sam, where can students find Queer to Peer, and like what kind of things like do you offer?
Yeah, well, we're definitely more of like a educational organization, so we can't offer counseling directly or anything like that, but we are a great resource for we try to table at certain events or do presentations that just tell people more about like USC's resources, national resources, things like that. So we can definitely like provide those as well. Like maybe you can like link some like the my SHR website or something, but yeah,
for sure. I'm sure we'd love to see you guys in the fall semester, but thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for tuning into this episode of the Gray Area. We're so lucky to have KG on as a guest, as well as Sam from Queer to Peer, and I hope you're all enjoying your summer, and definitely stay tuned for the next episodes of the Gray Area. This is my last episode that I'm filming, so I'm graduating, in
No.
less than 2 weeks.
Congratulations.
Thank you,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
But there's much more exciting content to come, so definitely stay tuned. You can find KG and Sam at /queer-to-peer once the school semester starts again. But thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.